Please, you have to save me. You're the only one who can. Little Willa was only 6 years old. For 3 months, she hadn't slept through a single night. Every morning, the 8 blocks to Monroe Elementary felt like 8 miles through a Chicago war zone. The bruises on her arms were real. The tears she cried every night were real. And every adult, the very people who should have protected her, looked the other way. Monroe Elementary said there wasn't enough proof. Principal Whitfield said the Langford family was too powerful that they couldn't be touched. Her mother, Brin, a woman who had fought alone for 7 years, who had lived in a car, who had once been beaten by the man she loved, who had given birth by herself in a hospital with no one at her side, had begged 5 times. And 5 times all she got back was silence. Then one morning, something inside Willa simply snapped in two. Not loudly, not with screaming. Quietly, like a string breaking in the chest, she couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't wait anymore. And she did something no 6-year-old in Chicago should ever have to do. She crossed the street everyone in the West Side told her to stay away from. The street grown-ups hurried past and children crossed to avoid, and she walked straight up to 2 West Side Syndicate bodyguards, so large they could have crushed her with one hand. She looked them in the eyes and said 6 words. "I need to see Cale Mercer." A heavy silence fell over the freezing street corner. The taller bodyguard, a ruthless man who had broken bones without breaking a sweat, stared down at the tiny girl. He should have chased her away. He should have laughed. Instead, his cold eyes caught sight of the dark purple bruises circling her fragile wrists. The sheer absurdity of a battered child demanding to see the city's deadliest king paralyzed him. He pressed a thick finger to the earpiece hidden in his collar and spoke in a low, disbelieving murmur. High above the chaotic Chicago streets, 36 floors up in a penthouse made of bulletproof glass and cold marble, Cale Mercer sat at a sprawling mahogany desk. He was 36 years old and rolled the West Side Syndicate with absolute, terrifying precision. His eyes were dark and hollow from a lifetime of violence. The room smelled of expensive leather and stale coffee. His enforcer Jack stood nearby with a thick file on their rival Brin and Hale. The radio crackled with the bodyguard's confused voice, saying a kid was down there asking for the boss. Jax frowned and moved to dismiss the alert, but something strange happened in the frozen heart of the Syndicate King. Cale raised a hand to stop him. He walked to the huge window and looked down at the tiny speck of a girl standing her ground against his lethal security. "Send her up," Cale said. His voice was a raspy whisper that left Jax completely stunned. The heavy glass doors slid open and Willa walked into a lobby that smelled like money and danger. Her worn canvas shoes squeaked on the polished stone floor as the giant guard led her into an elevator lined with mirrors. She looked at her reflection on the long ride up and saw a terrified little mouse trapped in a lion's den. Her hands gripped her backpack straps until her small knuckles turned completely white. When the brass doors finally chimed and opened, she stepped into the cavernous penthouse office. The air was freezing and heavy with power. Cale Mercer stood waiting by his desk like a living shadow. He wore a custom black suit that hid the scars of his brutal rise to power. His dark eyes locked onto her trembling frame. For 15 years, no one had dared to approach him without shaking in terror or offering millions in tribute. But this fragile girl with bruised arms simply walked forward across the massive Persian rug. Willa tilted her head back because Cale was terrifyingly tall and she was incredibly small. She reached into her faded coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper torn from a cheap notebook. Her tiny hands shook violently as she held it out to the most dangerous man in Chicago. Cale looked at her trembling fingers and slowly reached down to take it. He unfolded the paper with surprising care so he would not tear the fragile edges. He stared at the messy crayon letters pressed deep into the page. "I want to feel safe going to school." The simple sentence hit the ruthless Mafia boss like a physical blow to the chest. The blood roared in his ears and the luxurious room seemed to tilt on its axis. He could not breathe because he recognized those exact words. 29 years ago, a neglected 7-year-old boy had written that exact same plea on a scrap of paper in a cold kitchen. That boy had hidden the note in a wooden box because no one cared about his pain. That broken boy had grown into a monster who controlled half the city just so he would never feel helpless again. Cale stared at the crayon letters and then looked down at the child wiping a tear frantically from her cheek. She scrubbed at her face fast and desperate, exactly the way he used to wipe his own tears so his abusive father would not see his weakness. Jax watched in total shock as the legendary untouchable king of the West Side slowly dropped to his knees. The expensive fabric of Cale's suit brushed the floor as he brought himself down to Willa's eye level. He reached out with hands that had ended lives and gently touched her small shoulder. He asked her what she needed, and his voice was softer than anyone in the syndicate had ever heard. Willa looked into his dark eyes and whispered that she just wanted someone to walk her to school so the bullies would know she was not alone. It was an impossibly simple request for a man who commanded armies. Cale felt the ancient ice in his chest crack and shatter into 1,000 pieces. "I will walk you," Cale promised. Jax stepped forward with his phone buzzing violently in his hand. The screen flashed with incoming calls from Brin Hale and his men. A $10 million ceasefire negotiation was scheduled to start in less than 20 minutes. The entire West Side Syndicate was on high alert for the meeting that would determine war or peace in Chicago. "Boss," Jax warned in a flat tone. "Brennan is waiting at the docks and his men are heavily armed." Cale Mercer did not even look at his most trusted enforcer. His dark eyes remained completely locked on the tiny 6-year-old girl standing in his office. "Cancel it," Cale ordered with a voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. Jax stared at his boss in sheer disbelief, because Cale had never put anything above the business of the syndicate. But Jax nodded slowly and began typing the message that would insult the most calculating rival boss in the city. Cale held out his massive scarred hand and Willa slipped her tiny fingers into his palm. 3 armored black SUVs tore through the morning traffic of Chicago like a pack of wolves. The vehicles had pitch-black tinted windows and heavy steel plating that made ordinary drivers swerve out of the way in panic. Inside the middle vehicle, the air was perfectly cool and smelled of expensive leather. Willa sat in the massive back seat with her faded canvas backpack clutched tightly against her chest. She looked out the dark window as the towering skyscrapers gave way to the crumbling brick buildings of the West Side. Cale sat beside her in absolute silence like a coiled spring. He watched the way her small shoulders tensed up with every block that passed. He knew the terror of walking into a place where pain was waiting, and he felt a dangerous rage building in his chest toward whoever was hurting her. The convoy slowed down as the chain-link fences of Monroe Elementary finally came into view. Willa stopped breathing and her tiny hand reached out to grip the sleeve of Cale's custom suit. The 3 massive vehicles slammed to a halt right in front of the peeling green gates of the schoolyard. The screech of the heavy tires echoed over the noise of shouting children and chatting parents. The entire schoolyard slowly fell into a dead and terrifying silence. Mothers stopped their conversations and fathers instinctively pulled their children behind their legs. Everyone in the West Side knew exactly who drove those specific black vehicles. The heavy doors of the lead and tail cars swung open and 4 massive men stepped out onto the cracked pavement. They wore identical black suits and scanned the crowd with cold and dead eyes. Then Jax opened the door of the middle SUV and Cale Mercer stepped out into the morning light. The untouchable king of the underworld stood tall and menacing against the backdrop of a broken public school. The whispers rippled through the frozen crowd like a sudden wave of panic. Standing near the entrance was Mrs. Langford in her expensive designer coat. She was the wealthy mother who funded the school and protected the bullies who made Willa's life a living hell. Her arrogant smile completely vanished the moment she recognized the terrifying man standing by the gate. She dragged her daughter Peyton behind her and backed away with her face draining of all color. Cale did not even glance at the terrified wealthy woman or her cruel child. He reached into the dark interior of the SUV and gently helped Willa step down onto the sidewalk. The little girl was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered in the cold morning air. She looked at the towering school doors and a fresh wave of tears spilled over her pale cheeks. The fear of 3 months of torment was too much for her small body to carry. She tried to take a step forward, but her worn canvas shoes remained glued to the concrete. Cale saw her panic and did something that made the entire schoolyard gasp in shock. The ruthless Mafia boss dropped straight to his knees on the freezing and dirty concrete. He ignored the stares of the parents and the calculating looks of his own bodyguards. He reached up and used his scarred thumb to gently wipe the hot tears from Willa's cheeks. "Look at me," Cale whispered in a voice that was miraculously soft. Willa forced her blurry eyes to meet his dark and steady gaze. "You are not walking in there alone ever again," he told her with absolute certainty. "I am going to walk you to your classroom, and then I am going to sit on the bench outside your door." Willa sniffled and asked if he would really stay all day long. Cale promised her that he would not move from that peeling wooden bench until the final bell rang. He stood up and took her small hand in his, and together they walked through the gates, while the rest of the world held its breath. Brin Holloway wiped her cracked and bleeding hands on a faded dish towel. She was 27 years old and drowning in $300,000 of debt. The brutal medical bills and the predatory survival loans from her abusive ex-husband sat in a massive pile on her chipped kitchen table. She walked to the window to close the blinds against the harsh Chicago wind. Her heart suddenly stopped beating in her chest. 3 massive black SUVs were parked on the cracked pavement directly below her third-floor apartment. Heavy men in dark suits stood like statues around the vehicles. Then the back door of the middle car opened and her breath caught in her throat. Her little Willa stepped out onto the sidewalk, and her 6-year-old daughter was holding the hand of the most terrifying man Brin had ever seen. Brin did not think, and she did not wait. She just ran. She tore open her apartment door and rushed down the narrow hallway just as the heavy footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Cale Mercer crested the landing, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was too large and too immaculate for this crumbling building. Brin grabbed Willow by the shoulder and pulled the child firmly behind her own fragile body. She shielded her daughter with a fierce and desperate maternal instinct. Cale stopped walking and looked down at the battered woman standing in his path. His enforcer Jax waited 2 steps behind him with his hands resting casually near his concealed weapons. But Cale did not raise his voice, and he did not make a single threatening move. He simply stood there and waited for the terrified mother to speak. Brin pushed her daughter safely inside the apartment and turned back to face the king of the West Side Syndicate. The tiny kitchen smelled of cheap soap and boiling pasta. Cale stepped over the threshold, and his dark presence instantly swallowed all the oxygen in the room. He was a creature of absolute violence and unlimited wealth standing on her peeling linoleum floor. Brin felt her knees shaking wildly under her worn denim jeans. But she lifted her chin and forced herself to look directly into his dead and hollow eyes. "I know exactly who you are," Brin said in a voice that trembled but did not break. "I know what you do, and I know what those cars mean. And I am terrified of you." The words hung in the cramped kitchen like suspended shards of glass. For 15 years, no one had ever looked Cale Mercer in the eyes and spoken such a raw and unfiltered truth. His enemies lied to him constantly, and his allies cowered in his dangerous presence. But this exhausted woman weighing barely 110 pounds simply told him the truth to his face. She was drowning in massive debt and completely broken by the world, but her spine was forged from absolute steel. Cale looked at her trembling hands and the fierce fire burning in her exhausted eyes. The absolute ruler of the Chicago underworld felt something shift deep inside his frozen chest. He did not step forward to intimidate her, and he did not raise his voice to demand her respect. "You have every right to be afraid," Cale said softly. "But my hands will never hurt you or your child." That night, Brin did not sleep a single wink. She sat in the dark living room with a glowing laptop balanced on her knees. The cheap heater rattled in the corner, but her blood ran completely cold. She typed Cale Mercer into the search bar and fell down a terrifying rabbit hole of Chicago underworld rumors. She scrolled past redacted police reports and buried news articles until she found a phrase that made her stomach turn. Warehouse 11. It was a massacre from 5 years ago that the police had quietly swept under the rug. The article described a brutal syndicate execution involving fire and unmatched ruthlessness. There were no survivors and no witnesses left standing, and the invisible hand behind the slaughter was heavily implied to be the boss of the West Side Syndicate. Brin stared at the horrific details while listening to the soft breathing of her daughter in the next room. She realized the man who had gently wiped away Willa's tears was a literal monster. But she also knew that monsters were exactly what it took to scare away the demons at Monroe Elementary. The next morning, exactly at 7:30, the 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop outside her building. Cale climbed the 3 flights of concrete stairs with his usual silent grace. He wore a fresh charcoal suit and his dark eyes were scanning the hallway for any hidden threats. He reached the door and raised his massive fist to knock, but Brin swung it open before he could touch the wood. She did not step back to invite him inside the cramped apartment. Instead, she stood dead center in the doorframe and blocked his path completely. She wore a faded sweater and her eyes were dark with utter exhaustion. Cale stopped on the landing and immediately sensed the heavy shift in the atmosphere. He looked down at the fragile woman weighing barely 110 pounds and waited for her to speak. Brin looked right into his terrifying face and said 2 simple words. Warehouse 11. The air in the narrow hallway instantly froze solid. Cale did not flinch, and he did not deny the bloody accusation hanging between them. His face simply shut down into a mask of impenetrable and lethal stone. That cold expression was the exact look that made rival bosses beg for their lives in dark basements. But Brin had spent 7 years surviving a man who hit her and a world that crushed her. She was far beyond the point of cowering before an angry man. I read all about it last night, Brin said in a low and steady whisper. I do not care about the details, and I do not care what you did to those men. I only care about my little girl. She took half a step forward and forced the towering syndicate boss to look down at her. I let you walk her to school because she needed a shield. But if your violent world bleeds into her life, even a fraction of an inch, I will pack our bags. We will vanish into the wind, and you will never see us again. Cale Mercer was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld. He had a private army of lethal enforcers at his absolute command. But in that tiny hallway, he found himself completely cornered by a desperate mother. Every other person in his life would have twisted the truth or threatened him with police action. Brin simply laid down an absolute and unbreakable boundary to protect her child. Cale looked at her shaking hands and realized she possessed a courage that eclipsed his most hardened killers. He saw the fierce maternal fire in her tired eyes, and the ice in his own chest melted just a little bit more. He did not yell, and he did not make empty promises to be a better man. The ruthless Mafia boss simply nodded his head slowly. I understand, Cale said with absolute sincerity. My shadows will never touch her light. Then he stepped back and waited patiently for Willa to grab her backpack for the morning walk. Brin Holloway sat alone at her chipped kitchen table after Cale left. The shadow of the West Side Syndicate was a powerful shield, but it was also a dangerous trap. She refused to let a Mafia boss fight a battle she was meant to win. She opened her battered laptop and pulled out her cracked phone. She found the school directory and started typing messages to the parents she always saw crying in the parking lot. The first message went to Tamara, whose 8-year-old son came home with ripped shirts every week. The second went to Diane, whose little girl ate lunch in the bathroom to hide from the Langford crew. For 3 hours, Brin drank cold coffee and gathered the broken pieces of the neighborhood. The replies poured in with terrifying speed. Mothers who thought they were entirely alone suddenly found a fierce and unexpected leader. By 10 in the morning, Brin had collected photos of bruises and saved voicemails of the school secretaries hanging up on crying parents. She compiled the suffering of 7 different families into one heavy stack of printed paper. The walk to Monroe Elementary felt completely different this time. There were no armored SUVs and no towering bodyguards dressed in black. There was only a 27-year-old mother wearing a faded sweater and worn canvas shoes. But Brin walked with a spine made of absolute steel. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of the school and ignored the terrified whispers of the front desk staff. She did not ask for permission, and she did not wait for an appointment. She walked straight down the linoleum hallway and shoved open the heavy wooden door to the principal's office. Principal Whitfield looked up from his mahogany desk with a sneer of absolute disgust. He was a corrupt man who took bribes from wealthy families and looked the other way when poor children bled. He opened his mouth to order her out of his office, but Brin did not give him the chance to speak a single word. She slammed the thick stack of printed evidence directly onto his pristine desk. The loud smack echoed off the walls like a sudden gunshot. "I am not here to beg you for anything," Brin said in a voice as cold as Chicago ice. She pointed to the terrifying stack of papers documenting months of brutal neglect. "There are 7 families in that pile with photos and medical records and recorded phone calls." Whitfield stared at the papers, and the arrogant color began to drain rapidly from his sweaty face. He tried to stammer a pathetic excuse about the Langford family and official school policies. Brin simply pulled out her phone and placed it right on top of the evidence. The screen glowed brightly with a dialed number ready to connect. "That is the direct line to the lead education reporter at the Chicago Tribune," Brin told him with ruthless precision. "You have exactly 2 seconds to decide if you want to expel those bullies today or if you want to explain your correction on the front page tomorrow." Whitfield looked into her fierce eyes and searched desperately for a bluff. He found absolutely nothing but a mother who had survived a monster and no longer feared a coward. His shoulders sagged in total defeat as he reached for his phone to call the disciplinary board. The story of the West Side King sitting on a peeling wooden bench did not stay quiet for long. It spread through the crumbling Chicago neighborhoods like wildfire. Desperate parents who had been ignored by the police suddenly realized there was another kind of justice in the city. The penthouse phone started ringing with tearful pleas from exhausted mothers and broken fathers. Cale Mercer did not ignore a single one of them. He could not walk every vulnerable child to school himself, but he commanded an army that could. He called Jax into his towering office and gave him a new and completely unexpected order. Jax was a hardened killer who weighed 200 pounds and wore custom black suits. But the next morning, he parked his tinted SUV outside a middle school on the south side. He stepped out and leaned silently against the metal fence with his arms crossed over his massive chest. He did not say a single word or lay a hand on anyone. But the cruel teenagers who usually tormented a small boy named Jonah took one look at the stone-faced enforcer and immediately ran the other way. The silent revolution expanded rapidly across the broken districts of the city. Cale dispatched his most terrifying men to stand guard at local playgrounds and bus stops. Heavily armed syndicate enforcers became absolute nightmare fuel for schoolyard bullies. They sat on park benches and stood by chain-link fences like statues carved from solid ice. The sheer terror of their presence was enough to completely shatter the confidence of any abuser. Parents who used to cry themselves to sleep finally saw their children come home with intact backpacks and faint smiles. The West Side Syndicate was no longer just a criminal empire built on blood and extortion. It was transforming into a dark and twisted shield for the forgotten families of Chicago. Cale sat in his penthouse and listened to the reports of bullies backing down without a single punch being thrown. For the first time in 36 years, his vast power was building something beautiful instead of burning the world to the ground. But in the ruthless underworld of Chicago, no good deed goes unpunished. Across the city, in a dimly lit warehouse filled with stolen weapons, Brennan Hale watched the shifting tides with cold amusement. Brennan was a calculating predator who ruled the East Side with absolute and unforgiving brutality. He listened to his spies report that Cale Mercer was wasting his lethal resources on babysitting poor children. In the violent ecosystem of the Mafia, a sudden display of charity was never viewed as a sign of growth. It was always viewed as a fatal and exploitable weakness. Brennan poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon and smiled a dark and wicked smile. He realized the legendary king of the West Side had finally gone completely soft. The invincible armor of Cale Mercer now had a glaring crack right over his heart. Brennan knew this was the exact opportunity he had been waiting a decade to exploit. He immediately summoned his top lieutenants to the long wooden table in his hidden bunker. It was time to remind Chicago what a real monster looked like. Brennan did not waste a single second of his newfound advantage. He systematically emptied his massive hidden vaults and used millions of dollars to double his foot soldiers overnight. He recruited the most ruthless mercenaries in the city and formed highly specialized strike teams. These heavily armed squads were instructed to map out every single weakness in the West Side territory. They tracked the movements of Cale's diverted enforcers and took long-lens photographs of the schools they were guarding. Brennan plotted a massive and coordinated assault designed to usurp the entire Chicago underworld in one bloody night. He wanted to burn Cale's empire to ash and take the West Side by absolute force. He knew that if Cale was distracted by playing the hero, he would never see the executioner coming. The dark clouds of a brutal mafia war began to gather rapidly over the freezing city skyline. And right in the center of the impending storm was a 27-year-old mother and her tiny 6-year-old daughter. The Monroe Elementary auditorium smelled of floor wax and stale popcorn. The rows of cheap plastic chairs were packed tight with exhausted parents holding up their glowing camera phones. In the very first row, sitting dead center, was the undisputed king of the West Side Syndicate. Cale Mercer wore a custom charcoal suit and sat completely still amidst the chaotic noise of the suburban families. He was a lethal predator completely out of place in a room decorated with construction paper stars. But he sat there because a 6-year-old girl had asked him to come. Next to him sat Brin Holloway in a simple black dress with her hands folded tightly in her lap. They were not touching and they barely spoke, but the space between them felt charged with a quiet and impossible tension. They sat shoulder to shoulder like two battered survivors who had finally found a safe harbor in the middle of a brutal storm. The heavy red velvet curtains finally parted to reveal the scratched wooden stage. The bright white spotlight snapped on and hit the center microphone stand. The announcer called out Willa Holloway's name, and the auditorium went quiet with polite anticipation. Willa walked out from the dark wings wearing a bright yellow dress that Brin had bought from a thrift store and carefully hemmed by hand. Her small canvas shoes squeaked slightly on the wooden floorboards. She reached the center of the stage and looked out at the massive sea of faces hidden in the dark. Suddenly, the sheer size of the crowd hit her like a physical blow. The music started playing from the tinny speakers, but Willa did not open her mouth to sing. Her small shoulders froze solid and her eyes widened in absolute terror. The brutal memories of being laughed at and shoved in the hallways came rushing back to paralyze her completely. Brin gripped the edge of her plastic seat so hard her knuckles turned completely white. She wanted to run onto the stage and shield her daughter from the crushing weight of the silence. But before Brin could move, Cale leaned slightly forward in his chair. He did not wave, and he did not smile. He simply locked his dark eyes onto Willa and gave her one slow and steady nod. It was the exact same nod he gave her every time she looked out the classroom window to check if he was still waiting on the bench. It was a silent and unbreakable promise that she was completely safe. Willa saw the towering Mafia boss sitting in the front row, and her panicked breathing slowly began to steady. She realized the monsters in the audience could not hurt her because the biggest monster in Chicago was sitting right there to protect her. She closed her eyes tightly and opened her mouth to sing the first trembling note of her song. Her small voice started out shaky and incredibly fragile. But with every word she sang about hope and sunshine, her confidence grew stronger and louder. She did not sing perfectly, but she sang with a raw and beautiful courage that completely silenced the noisy room. When she hit the final note, a heavy silence hung in the air for one long second. Then Cale Mercer stood up from his cheap plastic chair and started clapping his massive scarred hands. Brin shot up right next to him with hot tears streaming down her face. The entire auditorium quickly followed their lead and erupted into a massive standing ovation. Willa beamed under the bright spotlight and practically flew off the stage and into the dark wings. Cale and Brin met her backstage amidst the smell of dust and old curtains. Willa crashed directly into Cale's legs and he scooped her up into his powerful arms without a second thought. Brin wrapped her arms around both of them in a fierce and protective embrace. For one brief and perfect moment, they were not a mob boss and a broken mother. They were a family forged from the ashes of their own survival. The applause from the auditorium was still echoing loudly in the dusty wings of the stage. Willa was laughing brightly as she buried her face in the expensive fabric of Cale's custom suit. Brin was smiling with tears of genuine joy shining in her tired eyes. For one beautiful minute, the brutal reality of Chicago did not exist at all. Then the heavy steel door at the back of the stage swung open and let the freezing night air rush inside. Jack stepped into the dim light with a face completely devoid of all color. He was a massive man who had laughed while taking bullets in the shoulder, but right now he looked terrified. He did not say a single word as he stopped 3 paces away from the happy group. He simply locked eyes with his boss and gave a microscopic shake of his heavy head. Cale felt the sudden plunge of icy dread in his chest. He gently sat Willa down on her squeaking canvas shoes and told her to stay with her mother for just 1 second. The warmth of the moment vanished instantly as Cale stepped away from the light and back into the dark shadows where he truly belonged. Jax pulled Cale into a secluded corner behind a massive velvet curtain. The enforcer kept his voice to a razor-thin whisper so the mother and child would not hear a single terrifying word. Brennan Hale just made his move, Jax reported with grim and absolute precision. He torched 5 of our main supply warehouses on the south side, and they are burning to the ground right now. Cale did not blink, and his face hardened into a mask of impenetrable stone. The loss of millions of dollars in merchandise meant absolutely nothing to the untouchable king of the West Side. It was simply the cost of doing business in a city built on corruption and greed. But Jax was not finished delivering the nightmare. He explained that Brennan had deployed highly specialized 10-man hit squads into the freezing streets. They were moving through the city and hunting down Cale's most loyal lieutenants with brutal military efficiency. The cold and calculated underworld war had officially erupted into a bloody street massacre. Cale clenched his scarred fists so hard his knuckles popped loudly in the quiet darkness. He prepared to issue the lethal orders to crush Brennan Hale into dust. But then Jax reached into his black coat and pulled out a thick stack of glossy photographs. "They are not just coming for our territory," Jax whispered as he handed the pictures over with a trembling hand. Cale looked down at the top photograph, and the blood completely froze in his veins. It was a long-lens surveillance shot of Brin and Willa walking up the concrete stairs to their run-down apartment. The next photo showed Willa sitting on the peeling wooden bench outside Monroe Elementary with her tiny backpack. The final picture documented their exact daily schedule written down to the very minute. Brennan Hale had sent his invisible ghosts to watch the only 2 people Cale Mercer had ever cared about. The ruthless rival boss had found this single fatal weakness in the invincible armor of the West Side King. Cale stared at the smiling face of the little girl in the photo and felt a murderous rage erupt deep in his soul. His innocent new family was the prime target of a man who possessed absolutely zero mercy. The fragile illusion of a peaceful suburban life shattered into a million jagged pieces. Cale knew he could not stay in this warm auditorium and pretend to be a normal man anymore. He had to plunge back into the bloody reality of his dark empire to keep the monsters away from their door. Cale slipped the terrifying photographs inside his suit jacket and walked back to the bright lights of the stage wings. Brin took one look at his dead eyes and her joyful smile instantly disappeared. She had survived enough violent men to recognize the cold shadow of war falling over his face. "I have to leave right now," Cale told her in a voice stripped of all emotion. Brin pulled Willa slightly closer to her legs and nodded her head in silent understanding. She knew his violent world was finally calling him back into the dark, and she could not stop him. Willa looked up with wide and confused eyes and asked if he was still coming back for Friday dinner. Cale dropped to his knees one last time and looked at the little girl in the yellow dress. He swore on his life that he would always come back for her. Then he stood up and turned his back on the only light he had ever known. He pushed through the heavy steel exit doors and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The time for charity was over, and the time for absolute slaughter had officially begun. Cale sat in the back of his armored SUV and watched the city blur past the tinted glass. He pulled out his encrypted phone and gave Jax a set of orders that would change the Chicago underworld forever. He commanded his top lieutenants to gather every available enforcer from the west side. But before a single bullet was fired, he split his massive army right down the middle. He ordered half of his most lethal men to abandon their lucrative posts and surround Brin's crumbling apartment building. Jack stared at his boss in shock, because giving up half their firepower was a complete death sentence in an all-out syndicate war. Cale did not care about the math of survival or the millions of dollars left undefended in his sprawling bolts. He only cared about the little girl who had asked if he was coming back for Friday dinner. He told his men that if a single shadow crossed the threshold of that third-floor apartment, they would answer to him personally. Then he racked the slide of his heavy pistol and drove straight into the burning heart of Brennan Hale's territory. The east side of Chicago turned into a literal war zone before the clock even struck midnight. Cale and his remaining men kicked down the reinforced doors of Brennan's hidden armories and illegal casinos. They moved with a terrifying and absolute precision that left the rival mercenaries completely paralyzed with fear. Gunfire echoed loudly through the freezing alleys as the West Side enforcers systematically dismantled the heavily armed hit squads. Cale fought like a man who had absolutely nothing to lose and everything in the world to protect. He took a grazing bullet to his left shoulder, but he did not even slow his relentless and brutal advance. He cornered Brennan's top lieutenants in a flooded parking garage and delivered a permanent message written in blood and shattered glass. The brutal slaughter cost Cale dozens of his best men and millions in destroyed property. But by the time the police sirens finally wailed in the distance, the East Side Syndicate was completely crippled. Brennan Hale was forced to flee his own city like a terrified rat hiding in the dark. The pale winter sun was just beginning to rise when the battered black SUV pulled up to the familiar apartment building. The street was completely silent and heavily guarded by the invisible ring of West Side enforcers hidden in the cold morning fog. Cale stepped out of the vehicle, and his expensive charcoal suit was torn and deeply stained with dark blood. His knuckles were raw and split open from the brutal violence of the long and terrible night. His left arm hung heavily by his side, but he forced himself to walk up the 3 flights of concrete stairs. He reached the third-floor landing exactly at 7:30 in the morning, just like he did every single day. The door swung open and little Willa ran out with her faded canvas backpack bouncing happily on her small shoulders. She did not see the blood or the deep exhaustion written all over his incredibly pale face. She only saw the tall man who had promised to always come back for her. Brin stood in the warm doorway and looked at his ruined clothes and bleeding hands with wide and understanding eyes. Cale looked back at the mother and daughter and finally allowed himself to breathe, because his fragile family was completely safe. The morning air at Monroe Elementary felt completely different after the long weekend of blood and fire. The corrupt Principal Whitfield had vanished, and the newly organized parents now watched the gates with fierce vigilance. Brin stood on the concrete sidewalk next to Cale Mercer, and the heavy silence around them spoke absolute volumes. The terrifying aura of the West Side King mingled perfectly with the unbreakable steel of the fiercely protective mother. No one dared to whisper or point fingers as they waited for the morning bell to finally ring. Then a sleek silver luxury car pulled up to the curb, and the heavy engine shut off. Mrs. Langford stepped out onto the cracked pavement with her designer coat clutched tightly around her chest. The wealthy woman who had funded the bullies and rolled the schoolyard for years looked completely pale and utterly terrified. She did not march forward with her usual arrogant entitlement, but took slow and trembling steps toward the towering Mafia boss and the battered mother. Mrs. Langford stopped 3 paces away from Cale and Brin, and her expensive leather purse shook wildly in her grip. She had tried to use her massive wealth to crush Brin's uprising, but the 7 united families had completely destroyed her social standing, and her high-priced lawyers could do absolutely nothing against the lethal shadow of the West Side Syndicate standing right in front of her. She looked at Brin's steady eyes, and then glanced at the fresh bandages hidden under Cale's dark suit cuffs. "I am so sorry," Mrs. Langford whispered with her arrogant pride completely shattered into pathetic pieces. "My money cannot fix what my daughter did, and my influence cannot fight what you have felt." She admitted that she had purposefully looked the other way while Willa suffered, and her voice broke under the crushing weight of her own guilt. Brin did not gloat or raise her voice, but simply nodded her head with cold and absolute finality. The wealthy mother realized she had lost the war before she even understood the brutal roles of the battlefield. Then a small figure stepped out from behind the heavy folds of the expensive designer coat. Peyton Langford was 7 years old, and she had been the cruel architect of Willa's daily nightmare for 3 excruciating months. But today, the little bully did not have her cruel friends flanking her sides or a wicked smile on her face. She looked incredibly small, and her eyes were red from crying all morning in the silver luxury car. Peyton took one hesitant step toward Willa, and her expensive leather boots scuffed against the dirty concrete. Cale remained completely still like a carved stone statue, but his dark eyes tracked every single micro-movement the bully made. Peyton swallowed hard and looked down at the ground because she was too afraid to meet the terrifying gaze of the Mafia boss. "I am sorry I pushed you and called you ugly," Peyton stammered in a tiny and trembling voice. "I am really sorry, and I will never ever bother you again." The entire schoolyard seemed to hold its collective breath as they waited for the invisible girl to finally respond. Willa did not step backward, and she did not try to hide behind her mother's legs. She stood incredibly tall in her worn canvas shoes and looked directly into the eyes of the girl who had viciously terrorized her. She did not carry the crushing weight of fear on her small shoulders anymore because she knew she was completely safe. Willa looked at Peyton for a long and silent moment without any anger or hatred burning in her bright eyes. "I accept your apology," Willa said clearly so the surrounding parents and children could hear every single word. "But we are not going to be friends, and you need to leave me alone." It was a simple and brilliant boundary drawn by a child who had finally found her own powerful voice. Peyton nodded quickly and scurried back to the temporary safety of her mother's trembling hands. Cale looked down at Willa, and a rare and genuine warmth flooded his battered and frozen heart. The terrifying king of Chicago and the resilient mother shared a quiet look of absolute pride as their little girl turned and walked confidently through the heavy school gates. For months passed, and the brutal Chicago winter slowly melted into a gentle and forgiving spring. The heavy gray clouds lifted, and the west side streets felt entirely different under the warm sun. Willa did not walk with her head down or her shoulders pulled tightly inward anymore. Her worn canvas shoes stepped lightly on the cracked pavement, and her eyes were bright with genuine joy. The children at Monroe Elementary no longer whispered cruel things when she passed their metal lockers. The invisible girl had finally stepped out of the cold darkness, and she was completely thriving. Cale Mercer still parked his black SUVs near the peeling school gates every single morning. He watched from the dark tinted windows as Willa greeted her new classmates with a fearless and radiant smile. 2 little girls named Zoe and Bee ran up to hug her, and Willow laughed with pure delight. The heavy shadows of the Mafia world stayed safely hidden behind the bulletproof glass of the convoy, and the ruthless king of the underworld felt a strange and quiet peace settling deep into his weary bones. One bright Monday morning, Cale stepped out of his vehicle to wait by the familiar concrete stairs. Willa ran down the steps with her backpack bouncing, but she did not climb into the waiting armored car. She stopped right in front of the towering syndicate boss and looked up with incredibly serious eyes. She told him that she did not need his scary bodyguards to walk her to the heavy doors anymore. She explained that she had real friends now and they waited on the corner to walk to the school entrance together. Cale stared down at the brave 6-year-old and felt a sudden and violent crack in his battered heart. It was a beautiful and agonizing ache because the child he had sworn to protect no longer needed his terrifying shield. The ultimate goal of his violent war had been achieved, but he suddenly felt entirely obsolete. But Willa reached out and grabbed his large scarred hand with her tiny and warm fingers. She smiled brightly and insisted that he absolutely had to come over for Friday dinner just like always. Cale let out a heavy breath he did not know he was holding and promised her he would never miss it. Friday night arrived and the tiny third-floor apartment smelled intensely of boiling pasta and cheap tomato sauce. Cale Mercer sat at a small wooden kitchen table that was completely inadequate for his massive and muscular frame. His broad knees bumped awkwardly against the chipped wood and his expensive custom suit looked entirely out of place in the rundown room. But he felt more at peace in that cramped and warm space than he ever did in his cavernous and freezing penthouse. Willa sat across from him, swinging her small legs and talking rapidly about her colorful school projects. She laughed wildly at a terrible joke he made, and her pure joy filled every single corner of the modest apartment. Brin stood by the rusted stove in a faded gray sweater and watched the terrifying Mafia boss listen to her daughter with absolute devotion. She saw the deadly enforcer who had burned the east side to the ground carefully wiping a drop of sauce from Willa's chin with a paper napkin. The stark contrast between his violently dark empire and his incredibly gentle hands made Brin's breath catch tightly in her throat. She placed a warm, steaming plate of food directly in front of him, and he looked up with dark eyes that held absolutely no danger at all. The night grew late, and Willa finally fell fast asleep in her small bedroom just down the narrow hall. The run-down apartment settled into a deep and comfortable silence that Cale had never once experienced in his chaotic life. He sat on the worn fabric of the living room couch and stared blankly at his heavily scarred hands. Brin walked slowly into the dim room and sat down right next to him without leaving a cautious distance between their bodies. She did not map out the nearest exit or look at him with the terrified eyes of a cornered victim. She pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the brutal king of the West Side with a soft and entirely unguarded expression. "I have spent my entire adult life running away from violent and dangerous men," Brin whispered quietly into the still air. "But you stayed and you fought the worst monsters in the city, and you never asked me for a single thing in return." She reached out and rested her small, fragile hand gently over his bruised and battered knuckles. Cale froze completely as her warm touch sent a massive shockwave straight to his frozen and heavily guarded heart. "I am slowly learning to trust you," Brin confessed with a raw and beautiful honesty that stripped away all his defenses. And in that quiet and dimly lit room, the absolute ruler of the underworld finally surrendered his entire soul to a battered mother who had saved him right back. Cale unlocked the heavy steel door of his towering Chicago penthouse. The massive room was entirely dark and incredibly quiet, but it no longer felt completely empty. He walked over to his huge mahogany desk and opened a small wooden box hidden in the top drawer. Inside the faded velvet lining was the crumpled note he had written 29 years ago. The desperate plea of a neglected 7-year-old boy was barely legible on the yellowed paper. But right next to it, Cale gently placed a bright new drawing done in messy colored crayons. It was a picture of a tall man in a black suit holding hands with a tiny girl wearing a yellow dress. Two children from entirely different worlds and separated by 3 decades had finally found the exact same salvation. The undisputed king of the West Side Syndicate stared at the 2 pieces of paper and realized his impenetrable walls had finally crumbled into dust. He was still a highly dangerous and incredibly violent man, but he was no longer a lonely monster wandering in the dark. His encrypted phone buzzed violently against the polished wood of his desk. It was not a message from Jax or a warning about rival syndicates crossing his heavily guarded borders. It was a desperate and tearful message passed along from a mother whose 8-year-old son was being terrorized at a school on the north side. A few months ago, Cale would have immediately dispatched a squad of heavily armed enforcers to stand outside the school gates like terrifying stone statues. But the world had shifted, and true power no longer always required absolute violence. Cale picked up the phone and forwarded the painful message directly to a 27-year-old woman living in a run-down apartment on the west side. Brin Holloway replied less than 3 seconds later with a fierce and absolute promise to help the broken family. She had a powerful network of determined mothers now, and she knew exactly how to dismantle the corrupt systems that protected cruel bullies. Cale read her swift reply, and a quiet and profound smile touched his scarred face. He realized that Brin was no longer a terrified and invisible victim hiding behind locked doors. And he was no longer just a ruthless executioner built solely for blood and destruction. Together they had forged something incredibly beautiful out of the darkest and most painful pieces of their broken pasts. They had become a solid and unbreakable bridge for the innocent people who had no one else to fight for them. Willa had reached out her tiny hand and dragged them both from the freezing shadows and into the warm light of a brand new life. Cale looked out the massive bulletproof window at the glittering lights of Chicago and knew his dark empire would never be the same again. Because the most dangerous man in the city had finally found a family worth burning the entire world down to keep completely safe. This beautiful and intense story of redemption finally ends right here, but the powerful meaning behind it will last forever. True strength is never found in how much fear you can cause, but in how much safety you can provide for the people who truly need it. Sometimes the deepest scars can be completely healed by the simple and innocent trust of a child. And family is never just about blood, because it is about the brave people who choose to stand by your side when the rest of the world walks away. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible journey here on Sunni Romance, where we believe every broken heart can find a second chance. We would truly love to hear your thoughts, so please tell us in the comments what part of Cale and Brin's story touched you the absolute most. Have you ever found unexpected strength when fighting for someone you love? Please subscribe to the channel and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the darkest nights always lead to the brightest mornings. We wish you endless peace and genuine love until we see you again in the very next story.